The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining APQC's webinar, The Humachine, How Humans and Technology Can Work Together to Define the Future of Enterprise. As a reminder, the audio is available through your computer speakers or dial-in lines, and all attendee lines are currently muted. There is a Q&A tool located on the right of your screen. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please submit them here, and we will answer them at the end of this presentation. In the event that we run out of time, we'll be sure to get to all of your questions in a follow-up email. I'd like to remind you that this webinar will be recorded and you will receive a copy of the slides as well as the recording within a few days. For now, I would like to take this opportunity to pass the webinar off to our Supply Chain Management Senior Principal Research Lead, Marisa Brown.
Thank you so much, Anna. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Nada Sanders. Nada is the Distinguished Professor of Supply Chain Management at the Jim Moore McKim School of Business at Northeastern University. She's an internationally recognized thought leader and expert on forecasting and supply chain management. Nada is the author of 7 books, most recently The Humachine, Humankind, Machines, and the Future of Enterprise. And that book is the basis for much of today's webinar. Nada is highly published in leading scholarly journals such as Decision Sciences Journal, California Management Review, Journal of Operations Management, Production and Operations Management Journal, and the Journal of Business Logistics. Quite an impressive list. She's also a lifetime fellow of the Decision Sciences Institute, has served on the board of directors of the International Institute of Forecasters, Decision Sciences Institute, and she's currently president of the Production Operations Management Society. Nada is a frequent keynote speaker and has consulted with numerous Fortune 100 companies. So without further delay, I take this opportunity to welcome you, Nada, to our webinar and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Marissa. I wanted to thank you, Anna and APQC for having me on. I wanted to welcome all the listeners, and I'm really excited to share with you content that I have based on multiple studies that I'm involved with. And this is ongoing, but I think a very important area. So I will share with you what I have learned and hopefully contribute to everyone's knowledge a little bit. So let me go ahead and just begin about what this is, how important it is. I can tell you everyone in the business community, in the business world, in all sectors, in all companies that I'm aware of, large and small, is talking about digital transformation, AI, machine learning, technology, what to do, how to proceed. And if we look at just alone the searches for the concept of digital transformation on Google, I mean, you could see how it skyrocketed, and this stat is 2017, and it's gone even higher since then. Everybody is talking about it. We have so much hype and confusion with regard to it. I can tell you I have talked to hundreds of executives across all industry sectors. And one of the things that we find is that everybody says, well, we're behind. Well, first of all, not everybody can be behind because then what is average and what's ahead? But the reason everybody believes that is because that is where the perception is, that we have this incredible technology that somehow everybody else is using, and that's because of the media and what we see in the press and so forth. Digital transformation is the #1 corporate concern in a recent survey that we did for 2020. So that is what everybody is talking about. Now, looking back at 2019, 70% of all digital transformation initiatives did not reach their goals, 70%. And so of the 1.3 trillion that was spent on DT, that was in 2019, that meant 900 billion went to waste. So we have to ask ourselves as to why that is the case. We know that it's a top priority, but we know companies are putting in tremendous amount of money and resources into it, and not getting the return. So where is the issue? And I'm going to address some of those things as I go through the slides, and I have a lot to share with you. One of the things that we're seeing is a third of the companies are really kind of taking this passive approach to AI. A lot of it really is, just kind of a deer in headlights, where you're sort of frozen because we hear all about machine learning and robotics and what companies can do or should be doing, but we're actually seeing a lot of companies sitting back going, where do we put our money? What do we do? Let's kind of follow the leader and see what's happening in our industry sector. And so we're actually seeing a kind of a paralysis, if you will. Many executives taking a wait and see approach to technology. A lot of them, and this is not a good thing, but they see technology as a plug and play solution. That is the one thing, and I'll touch on this a little bit later. It is a very different game now. It is a paradigm shift. Thinking that one can just purchase the technology, implement it or add it to current systems really doesn't work. So there is a different reality. A part of that is that just acquiring technology is simply not enough. And what we're also seeing emerging is a new and intelligent form of enterprise. And I'm going to share with you what the characteristics are and how companies can get there. So we all know that companies today are just bombarded with data. The intelligent enterprise is data driven. And whilst a few years ago we talked about needing more data, one of the biggest problems that companies have today is there's just too much data. Everything from RFID, and I've listed a bunch of these here, social media posts and sensors and digital click streams and so forth. Most companies are simply drowning in all this data. That's not really good, because what we're looking for is how to get insights and how to get information from that data rather than just the data itself. I can tell you one thing, none of the companies that we have talked to have access to clean data that gives them insights in real time. None of them. And the amount of time from having the actual raw data to where they can actually get the data cleaned and scrubbed varies tremendously, from 24 hours to many days. And in fact, now when we look to things like analytics and artificial intelligence and so forth to actually give us an answer or give us a solution, we have to be doubly sure that all this data is clean, that is not biased. I can just talk about the importance of clean data as a separate issue, but it is critically important because as a decision maker, at whatever level of the organization or the enterprise you're in, when you get the output, you have to be assured that you are getting output that is based on clean data, that has been scrubbed, that does not have errors, that is unbiased. Otherwise, you could be making decisions on completely erroneous data and information. Next. So what I have here is just to show you that we need intelligence that actually drives the enterprise, that senses and ultimately is able to respond to the information that it gets. And what I have here is a little more detail. So we start with the data, the kind of data that I just shared with you. But we need to get that data in a digitized form through sensing, capturing, so forth, and be able to turn it then into actual information. That information in a way where it is connected throughout the enterprise. It is not helpful if you have one entity of the enterprise with the information and it is not shared seamlessly throughout the enterprise. And then we want insight from that. So one thing is data, something else is information. And yet something else is actual intelligence. It's having insight to be able to do diagnosing, predicting, prescribing, to be able to visualize all of that. And then when we have that, how do we adapt to it? What do we do with that, actually? How do we orchestrate the response in order to be able to utilize the information that we have? So just the data alone is not doing us any good if we can't convert it into information, get insight out of it, and then actually, as an enterprise and our supply chain, be able to respond to it. And let me just say this, and I'm kind of jumping way ahead here, and I'll go into more details, but it is far more important, in my experience and what I've seen with companies, far more important to have this sort of seamless connectedness across the enterprise and a lower level of technology than a higher level of technology along one sector that isn't connected to the rest of the enterprise. If you know theory of constraints, you know how information flows and how delegation flows and how action flows, then again, if you have these pockets of excellence, as I've labeled them, but they're not connected, it's not going to do any good for the enterprise as a whole. The reason for that, and I have this on this slide, is the enterprise is a system. So a system has to be optimized. Don't forget that. Don't forget that an enterprise is a system. So what happens is when we hear all the incredible things that technology can do today, AI diagnosing melanoma better than physicians, of course, AI is masterful at pattern recognition. All these capabilities are one event, but an enterprise is a connected system, and rather than optimizing any one activity, you need to optimize the entire system. So information at any one lever has to be conveyed to the other levers. I've put, and this is my own it's very common notation. I broke it up into buy, make, move, and sell. I've seen similar lingos in companies, but the idea is the same. You've got marketing, right, that sells. Whether it's a B2B or B2C, you need to be able to produce and move products. Whether it's work in process inventory or supply, you need to be purchasing materials. The key is that the technology that is implemented communicates and talks along the levers. I have seen more than one company fail because they have implemented superior technology, say on the marketing end, where they're really communicating with the customer but not able to deliver. The marketplace is such today that you have to be able to deliver on the promises made. So again, the connectedness of the system is one of the most critical things when it comes to implementing technology. Oops, I think I went one ahead here. I've just given here just for information purposes. You've seen most of these, the kinds of capabilities that we see. They're absolutely amazing on the marketing side, and we see leaders, industry leaders in retail especially, doing things like, cross-selling and in-store behavior analysis and price optimization. Amazon's doing it, Zara's doing it. I mean, it's marvelous. We see analytics capability in transportation with, routing and scheduling. UPS is absolutely masterful at this. We see in production facilities, layout, location, workforce analytics. We see it in the auto industry, various sectors. And certainly in the buy side, whether we look at supplier risks, where we look at sourcing channel options, and so forth. Again, the analytics capability is tremendous. The key is for us to make sure that we're able to get the connectivity and the information that we get on one end connecting to the other. So for example, obviously, we may be doing a marvelous thing on the selling side, but if there is a supply shortage going on, We have to be able to communicate, use AI in a lot of different ways. Right now, as I speak, we're all watching the coronavirus going on and what's happening on the sourcing side with factory shutdowns, what's happening to this entire pipeline of goods. Technology and AI is really good to kind of help us look at alternative sources of supply, of production, and be able to link it to the selling side. So again, stressing what I already said is optimizing the system rather than the one entity. One of the things that we came up in our executive survey that we did recently is that 88% of respondents had stated technology is their priority. We found that 72% will make some technology investment in the coming year. 83% have concerns regarding costs of technology and adoption. So these two go hand in hand in terms of, what is the cost? How do we adopt it? And how long is it actually going to take to actually fit in with the current systems that we have? One thing I wanted to note with regard to this item too is we have observed differences in companies, some simply saying, well, we're not looking at the traditional payback period, but looking at investment in technology more as a strategic weapon. Other companies are really kind of doing the more traditional approach and saying, who's going to pay for this? What's the payback period? We found that, again, some of the companies that are leading in this space are investing in it more as a strategic initiative and not really expecting a very short payback period. 85% stated that they were awash in data. This was really a universal sentiment. And again, I want to caution everybody listening of the importance of clean data, and this is a really serious serious danger because we end up making decisions on poor data. They will drive everything, and that is the old garbage in, garbage out. And lastly, we found 82% engaged in fragmented implementation efforts, the very thing that I just talked about on the previous slide, that you see companies that are very excited about some technologies, AI, say on one end, oftentimes in the marketing end, but not be able to invest or not investing in operations or delivery systems to make sure that these are connected, that the company can actually respond in the way to meet the promises made. I will tell you, a lot of the companies that we are seeing that are really pushing the envelope, that are becoming, if you will, the enterprises of the future, they're actually changing their structures to make sure that they have an end-to-end visibility, and that technology is in fact used for end-to-end visibility as opposed to the fragmented implementation that we find here. These are just some of the ruts that we have found companies kind of falling into. One is what I termed a needle in a haystack, and it's really crazy seeing companies just using analytics randomly to search for causation and relationships with the hopes of having something turn up. So one thing I wanted to tell you here that is really important is that the talent that the company has understands the context of what the business issues are and knows the questions to ask. That is, I think, one of the most important things today. Technology can do pretty much anything, and it can solve a lot of different kinds of things. And if we throw enough data at it and look for things, I'll tell you, we could find causation between your sales and your birthday and the full moon, So you have to know exactly what are the relevant problems to the business and what to ask. I have so many stories that I can just give you. I was talking to an analyst not that long ago who was very excited about a model that he had developed, and he said, "I told my wife I spent a lot of time on this model. It's an amazing model. I have optimized the content of our kitchen cabinet." he was really proud of this. And in my response, I smiled and so forth, but I thought, does that really matter? And I've seen this in business too. So you have to know what to ask. When you have enough data, what are the relevant questions in order for us to be able to, that are relevant to the business? And I promise you, if you throw enough of this and look for relationships, you are going to find relationships that don't really exist. The other thing, and this has to do with the fragments that I already mentioned, we see islands of excellence in companies. This is where we use analytics to optimize a process or a sub-process. And so we have functions that are incredibly efficient, but the system isn't optimized. And what's going to happen is, again, theory of constraints tells us this, it's like a pipeline where you have the inefficiency, it's going to create a bottleneck. So it doesn't matter that you have optimized one sub-process, there will not be flow through the enterprise itself. The other thing that we find related to this is what I term measurement minutia, trying to measure, everything, companies not knowing which KPIs, which metrics to focus on. I think, this is a whole segment on itself in terms of, which KPIs are important, which ones to use. And it's absolutely critical. And I think analytics can actually be extremely helpful here. You've all seen Moneyball, for example. It can be very, very important to come up with some innovative and insightful metrics. But being able to look at dozens and dozens and dozens of various KPIs oftentimes doesn't give us real insight, but creates confusion. So I think being able to identify and focus on key metrics without being paralyzed with too many is very important here. And the last item, what I've observed is really what I've called analysis paralysis. And we see a lot of companies really being overwhelmed with the rapid change of technological capability. And it's really hard not to tune out the hype. If you look at the popular press and you kind of see what's happening, we think that robots are running everything. We think that AI is running every leading company, and ours is the only enterprise that isn't doing it. Remember what I told you at the onset of this webinar? I said, every company that we talked to said, well, sort of apologetically, said, well, we're behind. Well, not everybody can be behind. And in this process, they sort of have this analysis paralysis. And we find essentially three barriers to implementation. Each one is a barrier. But one of the things that's important to note here is that they need to work together. So on the one hand, of course, we have people. We have oftentimes leadership that might have a very short-sighted view of AI technology, or trying to follow the leader. They might not have analytics talent themselves, or you might not have enough analytical talent. The culture may not be supportive or supportive enough. And culture, by the way, we have found is the most important element to technological success. In addition to that, there's processes are an issue with IT not being integrated, lack of incentives, silos, and so forth. And then current IT systems, the need to upgrade, current legacy systems, and so forth. One of the keys here again is that these three need to work together. So just trying to upgrade the IT without thinking about how it integrates with the talent, with the people, with the culture. Are we changing processes? As I had already mentioned, a number of the companies are changing their processes in tandem with both people and the technology itself, understanding that that interface and that interplay is the most important thing that is leading to success. I think one of the biggest mistakes that we've observed, my team and I, is companies trying to invest in technology. I already mentioned the plug and play. seeing it as this kind of plug and play solution, just one more thing to acquire, investing in technology and not simultaneously thinking about the people, the culture, and the processes that integrate all of these. We found that it was the human element that was the most critical component for technological success in enterprise. And that's the reason why the book that we wrote and the title of this webinar is The Humachine, because we actually discovered, to our surprise, that it's really the two together that it leads to the ultimate success. So when we embarked on this project to look at the role of technology and technological success in enterprises, I can tell you we went into this with the idea that we wanted to find out all the amazing things that AI can do, the kinds of things that we're all hearing about. We just wanted to find out more. And what is it that makes makes the success really work? And we found that it really wasn't the technology per se, but it was the human element in tandem with the technology. We began to observe that while the majority of companies are kind of sitting back and kind of in this analysis paralysis, as I already mentioned, we're seeing this emerging form of enterprise. And we began to study these companies like Google and Haier, the Chinese appliance manufacturer, numerous other enterprises. And we really began to look at to see what is it that they have in common. Zappos, and I mean, there's a number of companies. They're all different, but these leading companies have certain things that is common. So what was the common element? And we found that these companies actually combine the better qualities of humans, things that we as humans do, creativity, innovation, emotional intelligence, compassion, judgment, with the mechanical efficiencies of machines, the economies of scale, big data processing capabilities, artificial intelligence, all of that. I mean, look, at the end of the day, you and I, we are never going to be better than a machine at processing and crunching through large amounts of data. So let the machines do that. But machines will not, at least in the foreseeable future, have the creativity, innovation, emotional intelligence, and judgment that we have. And if you look at some of the greatest innovations, breakthrough innovations, everything from the microwave to sticky notes, I mean, I could just go on and on and on. They all came from human judgment, serendipity. Machines simply can't do that because they don't have context. And I'll kind of go into this here in a minute. But we find that the Humachine combines humans and machines really in a symbiotic relationship where they're co-workers. So it's not a question of just going out and getting the robots and getting the machines. And I'm seeing, I'm even, seeing some recent publications in major journals I don't want to name that are saying the factory of the future, the enterprise of the future is completely robot driven, AI driven. I disagree. I think that, and I'll tell you right now, that is something that is copyable. So what happens when everybody has the same technology? What is the differentiating factor? It's the ability and the way to combine your talent, the human element, with the machine itself to create this symbiosis. And the thing is, what we found is this wasn't science fiction. This is already here, and we're seeing companies doing it. And so while we're touting all the merits of technology, we are finding that it's this combination that is sort of the secret sauce or secret ingredient that makes it work. And that's why we came back and said, let's call this the Humachine, because this is really what it is. Now, there's actually science behind this, why it works. And it works. It's proven to us by something called Moravec's paradox. Moravec is a computer scientist at Carnegie Mellon, and it is something that he's observed, teams have observed, and it came to be known as Moravec's paradox. But what it simply is that, as counterintuitive as it may seem, the best way to take advantage of emerging technologies is to invest more in human resources through reskilling and upskilling and lifelong learning, because Moravec's paradox tells us that what humans are naturally gifted at, machines are deficient, and vice versa. So the key is to leverage these. And when we apply Moravec's paradox to management, it's really pretty crazy when we look at this. What can machines do? Well, they can process large data sets. They have precision and accuracy that we just simply don't have. I mean, we get tired, our eyes glaze over, Friday afternoons, we can't wait to leave work. Machines are flexible. They can easily scale up and down. They have strength. They have speed. Humans can't do this. But what machines cannot do, they're only as good as the data. Remember, I already mentioned that multiple times. One of my areas of expertise is in forecasting. I've been doing forecasting 25 years, and I've worked heavily in the area. And one of the things we've talked about forever is the importance of clean data. Well, clean data, or the problem of dirty data, is now greater than ever. And it's a real issue. And the more data we have, the more potential for it. The machines are only as good as the data that is given to it. You give it dirty data, you give it biased data, you give it misleading data, it'll give you output. And you might think, well, look, the algorithm came up with it, but unless someone has gone through and really scrubbed and make sure that this data is clean, it's a real problem. I could tell you, more data is not necessarily better, and that's a whole different conversation, but trust me on that. More data isn't necessarily better. You want clean, good data, not lots of data. Machines lack creativity and innovation. As I mentioned to you, they don't have context. I mean, you can have this algorithm or this robot going through this incredible computation and not realize that the room is on fire, right? I mean, you would obviously, as a human being going through computation, if you realize the facility is on fire, you're going to implement different courses of action. Context really matters, and also understanding things. So yes, AI can recognize patterns. It can recognize that, there is a hot dog, and then there is a dog, and there's a pet, but it doesn't really know that you eat one and you really don't eat another one, and it can recognize a Frisbee, but it might not be able to tell you, well, you can play with a Frisbee and what you can and cannot do. You can't eat a Frisbee and so on. And so machines just don't have that context or ability to translate it. An AI in, say, the automotive sector, and we see a lot in terms of, AI and autonomous vehicles, you can't translate that to, well, you're driving a car, you're also going to drive a motorcycle and a bicycle. As humans, we can do these skills. We can drive a car and a truck and a motorcycle. We have transference of these skills. The other thing, machines can't explain their decisions. They just have output. I can tell you, boards, shareholders, customers, suppliers, they all want a human to explain risks, to explain why the output is the way it is. So that's a real issue. And of course, they lack empathy and emotion. Humans, of course, they can connect unrelated areas. We're creative and we're highly innovative. We can explain our decisions, and we have the empathy and emotion, but of course we have incredible processing limitations. We get to a certain level and we really can't process more than is already there. we're subject to so many cognitive biases, and these have been studied in the literature of psychology. They're actually kind of fun to look at, and to look at that we're all, you and I, we're all guilty of them. We can't help it. We're obviously inconsistent. There have been so many studies and experiments that are also fun to look at, where you give managers the exact same scenarios, randomized, and what you find is they consistently are inconsistent, right? And it has to do with, oh, did you have lunch, or are you tired, or is it the end of the day, or is it Monday, or are you stressed? All of that kind of stuff. And of course, we have physical limitations in terms of lifting and processing physically. I mean, we are not as strong as robots, and this is where robots beat us. But notice the complementarity. Notice that it's exactly opposite, and that's what Moravec's paradox tells us. And so when you look at it as a complete whole, you realize, wow, let's use machines for these things. Don't even worry about humans for those capabilities, but use humans for where they are good at. So when we look at Moravec's paradox, machines and humans have different capabilities where one excels, the other struggles. We can lay on that something that's called Kasparov's law. Kasparov, or Garry Kasparov, is the famous undefeated chess champion. And Kasparov's law is something that refers to the triumph of process. And I'll be pretty brief here, but let me tell you that Garry Kasparov in the 90s was undefeated. His defeat in chess came from IBM's Deep Blue computer. So that was his first defeat, and it was not by a human, it was by a computer. And it was really a devastating blow to this grand champion. A few years later, what he wanted to do was he wanted to see, was it possible at all for humans to ever prevail over machines. He ended up holding this grand chess tournament, this grand championship. And what happened is he pitted advanced chess players against advanced chess playing computers against teams of chess players and their own computers. So you had advanced individuals, you had advanced computers, and you had teams of the two. What happened was the winner of this grand championship was a real shocker, was a real surprise. It was two amateur chess players that nobody had ever heard of with their homegrown computer algorithm. Later, when they were interviewed, when they talked about it, when it was dissected, how did they win against these chess champions and against these great computers? They said it was a really good methodology. The methodology they had perfected really told them when to use the computer, when to use human judgment. So it was really a clever process. Remember, the clever process beat out the superior knowledge of these grand champions and the superior technology. And this came to be known as Kasparov's law, the triumph of process, where you can take an ordinary person or ordinary people, couple them with ordinary machines with the right process to produce extraordinary results. So what we found in our book is if we couple this triumph of process with Moravec's paradox, where, okay, humans are good at something, machines are good at something, let's get a really good process to take advantage of those. That's really where we then end up with the Humachine, where basically what we're doing is we are, harnessing the data and AI to power the display of these uniquely human skills. And we're able to combine the virtues of machines and humanity to overcome the limits of both. Because remember what I shared with you, each is limited. They each have their shortcomings. And what we're seeing almost is an emergence of a super intelligent organization when they're able to leverage or take advantage of this. So what have we seen that are really Humachine traits? Well, being more human centric. This is really important. It's really very hard for a lot of organizations, but organizations that are focusing on talent, that are focusing on hiring the right people, keeping the right people, at all levels, by the way. There's a lot to say here. I don't have the time to do it, but it's really important not to be, for example, jettisoning your older workforce that has, institutional knowledge, because they may be more expensive to keep on. It's actually pretty foolish. I've seen organizations where suddenly the system isn't working and they have nobody with the know-how to make the decision that has the institutional knowledge. So institutions that are more human-centric, they're aware of the culture. I was at a presentation a year ago. A large pharmaceutical industry was very successful in the implementation of their technology. They won an award for it. And when they talked about what was the key difference, they said, well, we ended up getting the people to believe in the system. It was about getting everyone on board and to believe in it. So a human-centric organization. The other aspect is that the organization has intentionality and purpose. This is beyond the short-sighted profits, financials that a lot of companies look at. So we see a lot of these companies that have a higher purpose. Yes, of course, financials are important. That would be foolish to say otherwise. But we see these companies also having higher calling, and then what happens, everybody can rally around it. Think of seventh generation, for example, where millennials are so excited to work there because they actually believe in the mission. And then AI and technology is acquired and adopted to support this vision, right? So what's happening is you're not just acquiring AI and technology as an appendage, right? What you're doing is you are acquiring it in order to support your intentionality or your purpose as a company, and making sure that it actually fits in with the human element of the enterprise. And that, remember that the enterprise is optimized, that we talked about earlier in the webinar. Part of this is having actually meaningful relationships, meaningful relationships internally, meaningful relationships with your suppliers and vendors, and certainly with customers, again, whether B2B, whether B2C, and integrating that with the technology, not just, say, for example, going into an e-auction and just kind of jettisoning all the great supplier relationships you have had, but actually cherishing the ones that you have. Systems thinking, that goes back to the enterprise, optimization, seeing the system as a whole. The other aspect that we're seeing are flexible and fluid structures. We see this with Zappos. We see it with a lot of companies where actually you are kind of moving towards more flexible structures as opposed to the rigid hierarchies. And the reason for that is just simply to be able to adapt to changing times, to the technology, changing customer needs. The other thing we see are integrated work teams, and also physical and virtual work environments that actually kind of fluctuate and become really fluid. And there's so many ways that we can use technology to be interconnected globally. Some of the enterprises that I work with, they have these incredible teams, yet these team members might fly into Huddle once a month, but they're literally all over the globe. And I think being flexible, being able to connect people and just get the best talent that we have worldwide is one of the Humachine traits that we're seeing. Going back to the metrics that I had talked about already, we are seeing companies that have more aspirational and measurable metrics, including both. So what happens is, as you become more human-centric, you're including metrics that lead people to aspire to things, to encourage innovation and creativity, whether it be in product design or whether it be in process improvement, a variety of different things, not just the traditional number crunching performance metrics exclusively. We need both, of course. I mean, we can't just have this sort of everybody fluid without any accountability. That's certainly not the case. But I think there is a balance between being aspirational and and actually having the more traditional metrics. Here's a framework that we can use. And I'm actually, by the way, very mindful of the time, so I want to make sure I have a few questions left over, and I want to hit some of the highlights here as well. Start with really developing this purpose or vision, and really define it, and you could segment your organization, perhaps even in terms of larger supply chain segments that may be different, where each one has their own target market and their own purpose and their own vision under some maybe broader umbrella. It really depends on the enterprise. But that purpose, that intentionality, is a really critical thing. So rather than jumping into technology, it's stepping back and saying, what are we about? We see this struggle in retail right now. We see it with companies like, Macy's, very much of a hard sector, the retail sector, in terms of where are we falling on the spectrum in terms of everybody trying to move into the lower price point segments. It's really important to really identify as a company who you are and what you're offering. So we see a lot of companies that are able to reinvent themselves. Sephora is a great example of a company that has used analytics and technology and has really kind of tried to use the retail sector as kind of just a place to experiment. So it's really about fun and beauty, not just about cosmetics, because anybody can sell that. Shift from contractual to meaningful relationships, both internally as well as across the supply chain. Adopt technology that supports the vision and that integrates with people. The integration with the human element is actually a big factor. One of the things that I don't have time to talk about here because there's a lot to say is that interface, for example, dashboards, the way the computer output presents the data and allows us to do queries is extremely important, because if I'm an executive, I'm a manager, I'm a CEO, I want to be able to query the data in a way that I can ask questions of it, I can get the summaries I need, and that it's very easy for me to use, that it's integrated with my ability to think as a human being. And I have to tell you, there's some discussion about things like neural lace that you may have heard of, where we can implant chips. I know Elon Musk is a great proponent of it. I have to tell you, I'm not. I think it's dangerous. I think it's creepy. I have a lot of issues against it. But the idea that, okay, we can now just implement a chip inside our brains, it's going to allow us to be more like computers. I will argue that is extremely bad on so many levels. And I would argue, in fact, let's get more exercises, activities to get to become more human, to be more innovative, to develop more emotional intelligence. Let's focus more on developing the human skills, because that's the thing that we're finding is going to work. We don't need to make humans more like machines. Create flexible structures that break down silos. We talked about silos. I think all of you have heard about problems of silos. In my training, I'm an operations manager and supply chain manager, and I've done forecasting with marketing and the customer markets. And it's really amazing that we still talk about silos between, say, marketing and operations and purchasing. That should not be the case. We should know better. We should know that we need to integrate and have some interface between these, between the functions and with between technology and the humans. Implement steps to cultivate talent. It is extremely important at all levels. We're seeing lifelong learning really becoming the thing. I'm seeing a lot of executives, senior executives that are in their 40s and 50s and 60s that are taking, say, a weekend seminar in terms of, digital leadership or something like that. So it's not just people coming out of college or mid-career. This is just something that I think is part of our reality that needs to be just part of it. And I think it behooves enterprises to really offer that. It could be their own training, executive training. I've done executive training this past autumn for quite a few companies. It could be, paying for classes somewhere, but it needs to be cultivated and be ingrained and part of the culture. And then also move from traditional productivity measures to aspirational metrics. And of course, there's continuous improvement here, right? This is ongoing. This needs to be part of the culture. Where basically we're monitoring the metrics, we're monitoring the market, we redefine these segments. Then we continue to integrate people, and we're adapting to the environment. And so this is an iterative, flexible process that needs this is a living framework, if you will. It is not static, and I think that is one thing that is really important to keep in mind. Some of the implementation lessons, as I mentioned, begin with a vision. Know who you are. Absolutely, absolutely critical. I'm so tempted, there's so much going on. Again, I haven't mentioned in retail. You probably saw it the other day. Bed Bath and Beyond is closing some stores, but it's also revamping their stores, trying to make them less cluttered. That would mean obviously cutting down on the number of SKUs. And I remembered some years ago when Walmart, this was quite a few years ago, it was a CEO of Walmart that had come in and said, oh, we need to become more targety. And that meant, again, eliminating the SKUs and the aisles. And it didn't work because Walmart has a different image and Target has a different image. So, I keep wondering, well, what is the image that Bed Bath & Beyond is thinking? And of course, I'm thinking, create the experience for the customer that we're seeing that works. But start with this image, really understand who you are. What's the vision? What are you trying to do? Who are you trying to be? And I think that is really important for companies. Then assess the current state and allocate sufficient resources. I can't stress that enough. So the companies that we're seeing, it's unfortunate, we've seen a few that say, well, who's going to pay for this? What's the payback period? That is a little old school thinking, because by the time it's done, you may not be in business. You have to allocate sufficient resources in order for this to happen, because you can see it's pretty comprehensive. And invest more in people. Leverage insiders. I've done a lot of consulting, and I'll say you have inside talent. You don't need to be hiring external consultants all the time. You have some really great people. So many companies that I've worked with, I find, don't leverage the talent that they have already inside. Create this culture of belonging. People are afraid. So I'm telling you, just make sure that your people are not afraid to be creative, that they're not going to lose their jobs, that they're free to come up with new ideas, to new ways to work with technology, or new ways to position in the marketplace. If they're afraid, it's not going to work. And right now I'm seeing a lot of people afraid to lose their jobs. Utilize people for focused decision-making. Leave technology for the repetitive tasks. This is really important. And then find a way as to how, again, the technology is going to feed into the decision makers, the managers who are under pressure to make decisions. And remember, prevent that atrophy of decision-making. Don't get rid of the people that have been there for a long time. Leverage your insiders that really know how the business works. Integrate tech with people and processes. I already mentioned that. Not everything should be bot sourced. Bot sourced is a term we came up with. It's analogous to outsourcing. You guys know what outsourcing is. Bot sourcing is like outsourcing, only rather than giving the task to an outside vendor, you're giving it to a robot. Not everything should be bot sourced. One suggestion, again, depending upon what you're trying to do, you may want to start with a pilot. with a particular division or product group, just to kind of iron out the kinks, to get everybody ready. And then just to kind of give you an overall summary, not everyone or everyone needs to prepare for the workforce of the future. It really is a game changer. And while everybody is kind of in that analysis paralysis and watching the technology, the idea that it's a plug and play is misguided. The idea that we can just acquire it, hire a consultant, implement a blockchain, it's not going to work. This is much more comprehensive. But that also means that everybody, you and me, regardless of what level we're at, we need to be constantly reskilling and learning and staying current. We need to have a portfolio of literacies. We all have to have digital literacies to understand how to interface with the algorithms, with the machines, to interpret the output, to understand how they work and what the limitations are, but to also have broader literacies to communicate, to negotiate, to be able to take that output and be able to then make broader decisions. I'll tell you a quick story. This is true. It was a company that I was talking with, spent quite a bit of time with last semester, actually. It was November. They had an opening for an analyst that was unfilled for 3 months. Imagine that, an opening, unfilled for 3 months. This was in Boston. Hundreds of people had applied. What they required is for the individuals to come in and to go through a series of tests. They gave them a bunch of data. It was real data that the company had. But the problems is that some of the data, it was data by state, but some of the states, Florida, Georgia, the southern states, the data was incomplete. So all these contenders for the position came in, and they they coded and developed algorithms, some in R, some in Python, but they all said, yeah, but we really can't conclude a whole lot about the southern states from Georgia and Florida because the data is incomplete. The company said, that's right. So we need somebody to be able to tell us, what do we do when the data is incomplete? We know the data is incomplete. That's not a good enough answer. So that's what I'm talking about preparing for the workforce of the future and developing a whole host of literacies of systems thinking and strategy and so forth. And I'll conclude with just this statement. It was Eric Schmidt, chairman of Alphabet, former CEO of Google. And he basically said, look, people keep saying what happens to jobs in the era of automation. He said, I think there'll be more jobs, not fewer. Your future is you with a computer, not you replaced by a computer. And that is really the Humachine. So on that note, and you can see I could talk a lot about this, I'll open it for questions. And I promise you, given that we're almost out of time, I will answer any questions via email that you may have as well.
Well, thank you so much, Nada. That was incredibly informative and quite frankly, quite enlightening. So I definitely enjoyed it. I hope you all enjoyed it as well. This is our moment where we will take a couple of questions. It looks like we may have time for one and possibly two, and it looks like we had a question filtered through to Marisa. So if Marisa, if you want to go ahead and pose the question for Nada.
Sure. So thank you very much, Nada. To echo Anna, I appreciate your sharing your insights.
You're so welcome. You're so welcome.
So we have a couple of questions, but the one that I'll ask with the time we have is, you mentioned about culture being the most important element to success and the human side of it. But this person's question is, how do I get my organization's culture to change? Because they said today their company is definitely not a lifelong learning company. So what advice do you have for people who really need to get that culture change? How do they do that?
A number of different ways. And it really depends on the level in the organization of the individual asking and whether they actually have any authority. I think one of the really good ways, because it's hard, and I say this because I literally have talked to SVPs that say, you know, I'm on the supply chain side. It's really kind of hard to influence. So we've actually gone in and given a presentation to where we could just show data, you know, and it's kind of a innocent way to show that it is the culture. I am publishing content, the book, and I'm sorry, I really don't mean to plug the book, but the book, The Humachine, is chock full of data that shows this, that proves it. And I think that really being able to show the facts, look at who's succeeding and who's not. I mean, I think that's really where it comes down to. And I completely understand. I can tell you, I promise you, look, I'm an operations manager, management person. I was an engineer in a past life, so I'm pretty quantitative. Every company that we've interviewed, when we asked them what's the greatest challenge, the greatest bottleneck, they said culture. It got to the point where it was almost like a joke in my head, where we would ask the question and I would think to myself, oh my gosh, I wonder if they're going to say culture. And every single time they would say culture. So again, it's really in an innocent way, without jeopardizing your position, maybe sharing some data and facts, so the people in charge of the company can really begin to kind of shape it. And one other thing, if I may add, with regard to that, what happens is if you can get a few key people that are excited, that believe in it, it propagates. I remember talking large aerospace company, really on the cutting edge now, and one of the analysts was so excited, their whole team was so excited in innovation, and I asked him, I said, well, what happened? And he said, look, he said, it took hiring and bringing in a few people that believed in it, and then they were a magnet for everybody else. And once you get a critical mass of people that are excited, and then maybe you can do some team building, some training within the company, then it becomes just this thing that kind of, you know, grows out of that.
Okay.
And I can say more. I'm just stopping here.
No, that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Nada. So that's all of the time we have for questions today. If you have any additional ones, we'll be sure to answer them in a follow-up email. We have some additional related resources on the screen. So if you want to expand upon today's key webinar takeaways with some of these additional resources, we encourage you to do so. We also encourage you to contact us. Again, as Nada said, if you have any follow-up questions for her specifically, feel free to contact her or Marisa, or APQC's own Marisa Brown. We'd like to encourage you to connect with us through our social media channels. We hope all of you have enjoyed today's webinar. And just as a reminder, you will receive a follow-up email with both a recording link and a link to today's slides as well to refer to. So thank you, Nada. Thank you, Marisa. And we wish everyone a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Marissa. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, and have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you, you too. Bye-bye.